Arrival on Norton 12. The test begins. They thought Earth was just another backwater world, a primitive planet with nothing but noise, chaos, and short-lived creatures. But they were wrong. Buried in our blood is the legacy of survival, a history, written in fire and forged in hardship. When the stars finally noticed us, it wasn't our technology that terrified them. It was the terrifying truth that humans weren't born to run. They were raised to hunt. The transport pod hissed as the seal decompressed, releasing a stream of dry, ionized air that swept into the compartment. Eli Vance stood at the open hatch, boots planted firmly on the metal ramp. Before him stretched the cracked, red-brown terrain of Norton 12, a desolate moon choked with dust. Whipped by acid winds and soaked in cold storms, wind howled across the plain, kicking up pale grit that spiraled into the thick orange sky. Clouds above churned like boiling tar, and thunder pulsed in slow, menacing rolls. This wasn't just another survival test, it was the final exam of the Galactic Survival Course, overseen by the galaxy's oldest academic council. The rules were simple: survive, alone, for 48 hours, and build a shelter using only what the land offered. No advanced tools. No outside help. No second chances. Eli's face was calm, unreadable. He adjusted the straps of his pack and stepped down, the coarse dust crunching beneath his boots. Alien cadets followed behind, some with hesitation, others already scanning the horizon with sensors and probes. A 12-foot insectoid named Jorak began clicking his mandibles and waving a heat sensor across the rocks. A translucent, jelly-like being slithered toward a boulder. Her skin dimming in the shadow. Over the groups comes, the professor's voice cut through mechanical. Cold, absolute. You have 48 standard hours. Construct a functional shelter. From local materials, no teamwork, no imports. Survival is your own. Evaluation begins at final hour. The neural link clicked off. Silence fell, save for the wind. Eli crouched, scooping a handful of dirt. It poured through his fingers, dry, gritty, low clay content. Not great for bricks, but maybe usable with bonding agents. He moved toward a ridge of jagged stones and struck one with a compact hammer. The tone was dull but solid. Uniform density. Good for structure. He marked the spot with a metal peg and scanned the area. The other cadets were already working, some hacking at crystal-rooted shrubs, others melting mineral sands to make adhesive pastes. The atmosphere was panicked. Every alien was reacting like the storm could kill them within the hour. But Eli didn't rush. He took a strip of cloth and let it flutter in the wind. The gusts curved around the higher ridge to the north, creating a small natural windbreak on the eastern face. That would be his spot. Slightly elevated, shielded on 3 sides, and with a sun path just visible beyond the ridgeline. He didn't need a hut. He needed a home. Most others clustered low in the basin, rushing to dig pits or jam together makeshift shelters. Eli remained deliberate, moving like someone who had done this before, because he had Arctic survival trials. Jungle. Immersion. Sahara night builds. He trained across every climate Earth had to offer. Humans don't survive because they're strong. They survive because they adapt. And Eli? He wasn't here to scrape by, he was here to dominate. The first thing he did was outline a frame. He used a shovel to cut a perimeter 8 paces by 5. He worked in clean strokes, flattening the earth, packing it down by foot and then with his weight. As he cleared the zone, he spotted glints in the dust, small metallic shards, thin and curved like the scales of some long-dead machine. He picked one up, turning it to catch the light. Solar reactive alloy. Jackpot, probably old probe wreckage. The shards would work well as reflectors, maybe even heating elements. He began gathering every piece he could find, packing them into a side pouch. Others might have ignored the trash. Eli saw opportunity. Down below, the aliens were struggling. The jelly being Fura had attempted to bond layers of slick plant fiber, but her structure collapsed twice. Jorak's crystalline wood snapped with each flex of the wind. Every species had evolved for their own planets, their own ways to build. But this wasn't their planet. Eli cut several fibrous stalks from a tall, swaying patch of reed-like plants. Hollow, flexible, and sturdy like alien bamboo. He snapped one across his knee, testing the tension. Then he lashed three together, using a bonding sap he'd found oozing from a knot in the ridge wall. Pressed under tension, it hardened fast-like. Resin dot by noon, he had a leveled platform, a supply of solar shards, and a crude A-frame rising into shape. He paused only once to drink. He filtered water from a moist rock crevice using charcoal pellets embedded in a cloth pouch. It was slow, but it worked. The sky darkened. The first drops of rain began to fall thick and hissing like acid. Below, chaos erupted, screeches, shouts, crumbling frames. The jelly being fled into a hole. One winged creature tried to fly and was slapped back to the ground by a gust. Eli didn't flinch. He unrolled a reflective tarp woven from the alloy shards and stretched it over his frame. The acid rain hissed against it, running harmlessly down the sides. He ducked under, resumed work slotting together corner braces and carving notches. Into support beams. Night fell. Temperatures dropped. Alien structures broke or melted into failure, but Eli lit a small fire in a pit, fueled by dried lichen and sealed with heat stones. He ate a protein bar, wrapped himself in a thermal blanket, and reviewed his next steps on a waterproof slate. The wind howled outside, but inside there was calm. Outside was desperation. Inside was design. And he was only just beginning. Asterisk storms and strategy. Human calm versus alien chaos. The second morning on Norvin 12 began with a green mist rolling across. The rocks clinging to every surface with a slick acidic sheen. Most cadets emerged from their shelters stiff and soaked, their suits scorched or peeling at the seams. Jorak had lost half his dome to the overnight storm. Fura's membrane tent had dissolved before midnight. One winged cadet had flown off. Into the dark and never returned. Eli woke with the warmth of his heat stone still radiating through the moss-lined floor beneath him. He sat up, stretched, and checked his frame. The alloy tarp had held through the night. No leaks, no corrosion. He stepped outside into the sour wind, letting it wash over his skin for a moment. Then, without a word, he went to work, while others scrambled to repair broken shelters. Eli focused on reinforcement. The sap-based resin he'd used had hardened beautifully overnight. He tapped the beams. Each returned a clean, tight echo. He inserted cross-bracing and floor support using wedge joints and layered fibers. His hands moved in practice rhythm. Not because he was rushing, but because he had planned for this. The sun was still a sickly blur behind layers of cloud, but light enough to gather more materials. He followed a narrow path behind his ridge and located a sun-bleached piece of composite scrap. Possibly an ancient navigation panel, fractured and forgotten. To others, it was junk. To Eli, it was a ready-made reflector. He returned and began rigging it atop the structure. He adjusted the angle using a braided vine rope and pegged it in place. It didn't need to power a city, just a coil. Just enough to boil water or charge a light strip. Just enough to show the difference between surviving and living. Below, Jorak roared in frustration as his adhesive foam boiled under sunlight. Another alien cadet dragged a pile of snap stalks toward a half-melted wall. One tried to tunnel into the dirt, only to hit a layer of reactive minerals that burst into flame. Norvin 12 wasn't just testing design. It was testing discipline. Eli ignored the noise. He collected layers of flexible bark and shaped them into a gutter system. Using angled stones and channel grooves, he rerouted runoff from the acid rain into a crude filtration basin outside the cabin. He packed moss into layers, added powdered root bark, and topped it with a bark mesh. Primitive, but with slow enough flow. It would clean. As the wind picked up. Eli anchored the structure with tension lines made from twisted vines and jagged metal hooks. He tested every knot, every seam. Then he paused only to eat a handful of dried fruit and filtered water warmed over his heat core. Others screamed through the comms, begging the professor for support. They were met with silence. Eli's fingers ached. his back sore, but his expression remained still, focused. He wasn't here to prove humans could survive. He was here to show they could thrive where others failed. Night approached again. As others prepared to shiver, Eli adjusted a vent chimney to release smoke while retaining warmth. He unrolled a moss mat, settled into his stone chair, and checked the solar circuit. A soft amber light pulsed along the vine wire embedded in the wall. Outside, chaos. Inside, a quiet human sat cross-legged beneath glowing walls. Asterisk. Fortress rising, a cabin with a brain dawn came with the hiss of steam rising from the rocks, sunlight weak but steady behind the thinning clouds. Eli stood atop the cabin, anchoring the final layer of solar shards. He'd spent the early hours stitching copper veins into rigid plant stems, placing them in patterns he'd drawn by hand spirals for efficiency. Triangles for support. He climbed down, sweat on his brow, and stepped into the structure. The inside was taking shape. Not just functional, but beautiful. A floor made of tessellated stone and moss. Walls padded with compressed fiber and insulation sap. A stone shelf now jutted from the far wall, supported by hand-carved brackets. In the corner, a rain basin dripped steadily, fed by the gutter system outside. He activated the thermal stone core. Coils around it began to warm slowly, but enough to keep the cabin at survival temperatures through the freezing night. A nearby alcove, carved by hand, held tools and dried lichen for fire starting. Every piece had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Below. Some cadets had begun combining efforts, clearly against the rules. A few structures resembled patchwork junkyards cracked, shells patched with slime and sand. The professor, always watching, said nothing. Likely documenting failure in silence. Jorak scowled up at the ridge, his tall figure stiff in the cold. He watched Eli, studied him, then turned away in disgust. Eli drank filtered water, sat down beside his stone chair, and began testing a low-power heating loop. He scratched symbols on his slate calculations of flow, heat retention, energy draw. With a stick of carbon and a thin copper strand, he adjusted the angle of a shard, refocusing light into a heating point. The warmth was slight but constant. Afternoon. Light faded into violet haze. Another night loomed. Another test survived. Comfort is a weapon. Eli leaned back on his moss-covered chair, the glow of his cabin flickering with gentle warmth. He listened to the wind hiss against the outer walls, knowing that acid droplets slid harmlessly down the layered exterior. He didn't rush anymore. He refined. He took out a thin reed and carved a groove into its center, inserting a copper strand, then sealed it with hardened sap. A new switch for a light loop that would run above the stone shelf. He affixed it to the upper frame, adjusted the shard focus, and watched as the loop pulsed to life. Soft amber glow. Enough to read by. Enough to feel safe. And below. Another scream echoed across the basin. A shelter had buckled, smoke billowing from its seams. Another cadet's suit malfunctioned, acid scars lining its outer layer. The emergency comms lit up. A violation. Another failure. Eli closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't smile. He only felt focused. With steady hands. He finished attaching the interior divider, a moss-lined curtain to separate the sleeping space from the cooking zone. The air inside no longer stank of sweat or stress. It smelled of dried lichen, filtered steam, and warm stone. He poured water into a carved basin, dropped in a root shard, and let it steep. A bitter tea, but warm and earned. He sipped in silence. A human in a hand-built fortress, raised in 2 days with nothing but instinct, discipline, and a refusal to surrender. The confrontation, alien jealousy. Burns' footsteps crunched on the ridge. Jorak approached, his insectoid form stiff with rage. His claws twitched with every step. His mandibles clicked in frustration. "You cheated," Jorak growled. "You used advanced tech. That's the only way a human could do this." Eli stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Everything I used is from here, same as you. You look for tools. I look for systems." Jorak snarled, eyes scanning the solar wires and the reinforced walls. This isn't survival, this is a trick. A performance. Eli stepped forward. No, this is what happens when you train for centuries to adapt. You learn to see possibilities, not limitations. Jorek said nothing. His eyes lingered too long before he turned and marched away. Eli returned inside, adjusting the light flow. In his wall grooves, the solar charge held well. Warmth filled the air. The storm returned, and with it, more failures. But inside the cabin, human discipline reigned. Evaluation day, the fortress stands Talon. The final morning, inspection drones descended. They hovered through the mist, blinking with artificial scrutiny. Each cadet stood by their shelter. It could still be called that. Some had nothing left. Just tarps, scrap piles, or holes in the ground. Fur's membrane had dried into a crust. Another cadet had abandoned their post. A dozen stood silently, waiting for judgment. Eli stood beside his structure. The walls glowed faintly with solar warmth. The gutter trickled clean water into a basin. The wind was silent around the ridge. The professor's voice echoed through. The neural link. Evaluation complete. Final ranking. Eli Vance. Human. Score. Maximum. Structure deemed viable for extended survival. Sustainability. Confirmed. Innovation. Exemplary. Gasps. Stares. Silence. The fortress stood behind him, a shiny relic of stubborn creativity. The judgment. Respect earned through innovation. Professor landed in a skiff, walking slowly toward Eli's cabin. He circled it, touching walls, scanning circuits, inspecting the water system and light loops. This ... was not expected. He said ... Eli didn't reply. The professor turned. Your design will be archived. Future cadets will study this. You exceeded the parameters of the test. You redefined them. Other cadets gathered, eyes wide, minds humbled. Fura, wrapped in a drying cloth, whispered, "Can you teach us?" Eli nodded once. You all tried to survive the storm. I built something that would survive me. Jorek lowered his head. Even he understood now ... as the sun climbed over the ridge. The solar-powered fortress gleamed in the pale light. And, standing at its door, a human waited not to be accepted, but to lead.